Hello and welcome to the first of two seminars dealing with the subject of hearing loss in church life. The motivation for these seminars comes from a recent General Conference session in 2022 where it was voted to include a recommendation in the church manual that all churches around the world appoint an Adventist Possibility Ministries coordinator. Adventist Possibility Ministries was previously called Special Ministries, and that is a ministry based at the General Conference that tries to address the needs of 7 different areas of life challenges. For example, these areas are ministry for the bereaved, people who are blind or have low vision, caregivers, mental health and wellness, orphans and vulnerable children, people with mobility challenges, and the deaf and hard of hearing. This last group is where I fit in as a member of the Global Task Force for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. One of the tasks we have is to help create online learning resources for our area of interest. And you can get in-depth information by doing a free course about how to minister to any of these groups on the website www.adventistlearningcommunity.com. That's adventistlearningcommunity.com. This is the North American Division website that features hundreds of free courses on a variety of topics, one of which is Adventist Possibility Ministries. If you're really interested in getting involved in ministry like this, I recommend you do these free online courses. In the South Pacific Division, we have Christian services for the blind and hearing impaired, based at our Adventist Media Centre at the South Pacific Division office in Wahroonga, in New South Wales. You can go to the resources page on their website, csfbhi.adventistchurch.com. There's a lot of information in this presentation, but it is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it anytime. We're going to begin our program today with a focus on Mark 7, verse 31 to 37. But first, we're going to have a little prayer. Loving Father in heaven, we praise Thee and thank Thee for our opportunity to examine the special ministry for deaf and hard of hearing people. Lord, you know this group has been neglected for a long time in our churches. They get left out. But loving Father, we pray that you will bless as I speak and use my words to pronounce your words, Lord. Hide my words in yours. And give our viewers special insight, special interest, eyes to see and ears to hear, so to speak, as we go through this seminar. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. We start looking at Mark 7, verse 31 to 37. In verse 31 it says, "And again, departing from the coast of Tyre and Sidon, he came unto the Sea of Galilee, through the midst of the coast of Decapolis. And they bring unto him one that was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they beseech him to put his hand upon him. They took him aside from the multitude, put his fingers into his ears, and he spit, and he touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and saith unto him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. And straightway his ears were opened, and the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. And he charged them that they should tell no man. But the more he charged them, so much the more a great deal they published it. And they were beyond measure astonished, saying, He hath done all things well. He maketh both the deaf to hear, and the dumb to speak. This was indeed an astonishing miracle. It was common in those days to think that if a person was deaf or blind or disabled in any way, it must be because they had sinned or maybe their parents had sinned. But Jesus came to correct misunderstandings like this. As the spirit of prophecy tells us, she said, I saw that it is in the providence of God that widows and orphans, the blind, the deaf, the lame, and persons afflicted in a variety of ways have been placed in close Christian relationship to his church. It is to prove his people and develop their true character. Angels of God are watching to see how we treat these persons who need our sympathy, love, and disinterested benevolence. This is God's test of our character. If we have the true religion of the Bible, we shall feel that a debt of love, kindness, and interest is due to Christ in behalf of his brethren. She goes on to say, and we can do no less than to show our gratitude for his immeasurable love to us while we were sinners, unworthy of his grace, by having a deep interest and unselfish love for those who are our brethren and who are less fortunate than ourselves. Now let's take a look at the numbers that tell us how big this problem of hearing loss is in the world. According to data from the World Health Organization released in March 2018, 466 million people are currently living with hearing loss, and that number is predicted to reach 900 million people by the year 2050. So you can see there's a huge number of people involved around the world who have difficulty hearing, and I'm one of them. Hearing loss affects 1 in 7 in Australia and is expected to rise to 1 in 5 by 2060, in part due to Australia's ageing population. And it's an impairment that can affect people of all ages to varying degrees. But age, of course, is a large determinant, with over half of all Australians aged 60 years or older experiencing some form of hearing impairment. That's a massive 50%. That's 1 out of every 2 people over the age of 60 suffer some degree of hearing loss. Regardless of age, inadequate hearing care is known to drastically reduce a person's everyday functioning ability, their communication, their social participation, and their quality of life. It can happen at any age. And for me, it happened overnight. During a life-threatening struggle I had with meningitis at the age of 8. And I remember the event. I woke up one morning, I was very sick. I must have nearly died a few times. And I called out to my mother. And I was shocked because no sound seemed to come out of my mouth. So I began to panic and try to get more sound out of my mouth by shouting. And I shouted again and again and called out to my mother again and again. But I still couldn't hear any sound out of my mouth. I thought I'd lost my voice. But then I got a double shock when my mother walked into the room. Her mouth began to move. And I still couldn't detect any sound. And I realized then that I'd lost my hearing. Totally deaf. I couldn't hear anything. Well, you can imagine what that did to an 8-year-old boy. It made a huge difference in my life. As well as to my parents. But today, when I look back on that experience from the many years of experience as a professional hearing rehabilitation specialist, I know now what caused my hearing problem. And it was high doses of ototoxic antibiotics. We know today that many antibiotics are toxic to the human ear. They had to give me those antibiotics because if they didn't, the meningitis would have killed me. So it was my hearing or my life. It totally killed my right ear, and it reduced the hearing in my left ear to a very low level. That's why I only wear one hearing aid today, because this ear isn't suitable. Now let's take a look at the size of the ageing population in Australia. Here's a chart that puts it in perspective. It tells us that in 1947, only 12.3% of the population were 60 or older. And in 2016, just over 20% of the population was over the age of 60. But by 2051, they expect it will be 26%. And half of that number will suffer some degree of hearing loss. And that says nothing about the number of people in the workforce who are suffering from industrial deafness. Well, a lot of us, like a lot of Australians, might think, well, it should be right, mate. I'll just get hearing aids. But it's not that simple. Because from a professional perspective, specifying an optimal client outcome is complicated by the reality that hearing aids cannot cure hearing loss or restore hearing to its undamaged state. And this reality often doesn't fully occur for our patients until they actually wear the hearing aids and find that they still have difficulty hearing in noisy places. Because the reality is that hearing aids can only aid the performance of remaining hearing receptors in the ear. It cannot cure hearing loss. So we might ask the question, how do the hearing receptors in the ear actually work? I want you to watch a brief video.
Sound waves entering the ear travel through the external auditory canal before striking the eardrum and causing it to vibrate. The eardrum is connected to the malleus, one of 3 small bones of the middle ear. Also called the hammer, it transmits sound vibrations to the incus, which passes them to the stapes. The stapes pushes in and out against the structure called the oval window. This action is passed on to the cochlea, a fluid-filled, snail-like structure that contains the organ of Corti, the organ for hearing.
Many of us take for granted a very extraordinary organ, our ears. To understand the ear, we need to understand what sound is. The speakers you are listening to right now are vibrating, flexing in and out, causing a wave of pressure through the air. The frequency of these waves, or the speed at which the sound-creating surface moves back and forth, affects the pitch of the sound. The level of air pressure in each wave is directly related to how loud the sound is. The outer part of our ear catches these waves. It faces forward and has a specially designed structure of curves, helping us to determine the direction of the sound and also emphasize the frequencies used in human speech. Now that the sound waves are caught, they travel through the ear canal and strike against our eardrum, a thin membrane about 10 millimeters wide. Now that we receive the sound, the middle ear transfers this energy. The smallest bones in your body, the malleus, incus, and stapes, start in motion. The malleus is attached to the eardrum, and as the sound travels along, the force is amplified by leverage until it arrives at the stapes, which acts like a reversed piston, creating waves in the fluid of the inner ear. The most significant increase in pressure is caused by pneumatic amplification. The face of the stapes has a surface area of about 3.2 square millimeters, while the eardrum has a surface area of 55 square millimeters. Using this, along with leverage through the malleus and incus, the final pressure is 22 times greater than when the sound first arrived. Now we come to the most complicated part of the hearing, the cochlea. In reality, it is coiled up, but it is easier to understand straightened out. There are actually 3 chambers inside, but let's take a look at the central part. The stapes is causing pressure waves to travel through the structure. Along the inside wall is about 20 to 30,000 reed-like fibers. As the waves move along, they encounter fibers with the correct resonant frequency and energy is released. These fibers aren't actually what give us the signal that we heard something. There is a special structure next to these fibers containing hair cells. When the fibers resonate, they cause the hair cells to move, which then sends an electrical impulse to the cochlear nerve and onto the brain. Certain pitches of sound will resonate in specific locations, and louder sounds will cause more hair cells to move. Our brain interprets all this raw data, making it possible to enjoy things like music or an engaging conversation. Just to think that all of this is happening in your head right now at full speed. This is just one of the amazing systems found in the human body that go far beyond our humble human understanding.
What is the range of normal hearing? How do we measure it? Hearing professionals use the audiogram to measure hearing. The horizontal lines on this chart measures decibels or loudness levels. The further down the chart you go, the louder the sound is. And the vertical lines across the chart measure frequency or pitch, like the keys on the piano. Low frequency notes on the left, high frequency notes on the right. When we test hearing, the patient sits in a soundproof booth and listens to sounds across all frequencies at varying sound levels. And if you have perfectly normal hearing, your response will be straight across the chart as it is here in that green zone, say between 0 and 20 decibels. If you have a hearing loss, usually it happens in the high frequencies, where the high frequencies drop off, and it's much harder to hear things in those frequency ranges than it is in the lower frequency ranges. Typically, it means that women's voices, children's voices, are much harder to understand. Well, what do the various levels of hearing loss caused by industrial deafness actually sound like? We want you to watch a brief video that simulates the sound of hearing loss. You'll notice a variation in the sound levels. This is to try and simulate what it actually sounds like for somebody with the problem.
All right, so let me show you how sensorial hearing loss works and how it affects you. So we start off with a normal audiogram, as you can see here. As you can see, there is 0 decibels of hearing loss across all frequencies. This is why you're able to hear me very clearly. You're able to hear all the consonants and all the words in my speech because there's no hearing loss at any frequency. Now, if you start to expose yourself to some loud noise, maybe not a lot, but just enough to cause a slight bit of damage, you will start to experience slight hearing loss. I'm simulating here a 4,000 hertz 10 decibel reduction. It could be 3,000 hertz, it could be 6,000 hertz, it could vary depending on person to person, but very commonly it falls around the 4,000 hertz range, and you'll start to hear something like this at a slight 10 decibel hearing loss. Now, as you continue to expose yourself to loud noise, this will get worse. You'll start to fall into what is called a mild hearing loss. Now, there's nothing mild about this. Yes, they term it mild hearing loss because it can be much worse. However, the effects of it are quite severe. As you can see here, there's a 30 decibel reduction at the 4,000 hertz range. And although it's only a 30 decibel reduction, it's definitely enough to affect the quality of the speech. As you can tell, what I'm saying sounds a lot more muddy. It's not quite as crisp and clear as it was before. And in a noisy situation, it would be much more hard to understand what I'm saying. Now, if you continue to expose yourself to loud noise, of course, this is only going to get worse. The dip at the 4,000 hertz range is going to dip even further down. We're simulating a 50 decibel reduction here at the 4,000 hertz range. As you can also tell by the graph, the reduction is starting to spread into the other frequencies around it too, causing you to lose hearing in all frequencies, just more particularly at the 4,000 hertz range. At this moderate hearing loss level, speech is becoming harder to understand, and you're having to focus more on what I'm saying. You can probably still understand me, but it's not as easy as it was, and you definitely have to focus hard. This can get very tiring throughout the day, And in noisy situations, it's getting to be almost impossible to understand speech. If we continue to increase the hearing loss to 70 decibels at 4,000 hertz, we fall into what's known as severe hearing loss. At this point, speech is almost intangible. What you do hear is mostly vowels. There's hardly any consonants in what you're listening to because most of those consonants fall around the 4,000 hertz range. And if you have a lot of loss at that range, you're not going to hear those consonants, and you're mostly going to hear vowels. So speech is going to sound really mumbly and really muffled and extremely difficult to understand. Unfortunately, this can get worse if you keep exposing yourself to extremely loud noise. Eventually, you're going to fall into what is known as profound hearing loss. This is at a 90 decibel reduction at 4,000 hertz. You can barely understand anything I'm saying. It's mostly mumbling because you pretty much aren't hearing much of anything except for the low tone vowels. This is not ideal by any means. It's almost impossible to carry on a normal conversation this way. You'll have to shout or speak very loudly to be able to understand people at this type of hearing loss. Hearing aids are almost a necessity well before this. So don't ever let your hearing progress to this level. Never. Because once it gets down to this level, there's no turning back.
Well, what is the effect of hearing loss on people's lives? How does it affect communication, mental health and relationships, or socialization, especially in church life? The information I'm about to give you comes from an article I wrote back in 2009 called Communication Diet Theory, an Extended Foundation for Hearing Rehabilitation. It's still available on the website of audiologyonline.com. This article makes a comparison between the relationship between food for the body and communication and mental health. You've probably heard the statement that communication is food for the mind, and that's a good statement, it is. I can vividly remember the day when I was sitting in the university library in Washington, D.C., pondering this concept, when the question came to my mind, if communication is food, can we apply the principles of a healthy food diet to mental health and relationship health? It's a very interesting concept. And it also has spiritual implications. As we go through this study, examining communication between humans and how they interact, I want you to think beyond what I'm talking about and think about your communication diet or your relationship with God. How well do you communicate with our Heavenly Father and with Jesus? Let's begin by saying there are the three essential components of a well-balanced food diet. If any one of them are neglected for too long, the result is a deterioration in physical health. Let's look at them. The first one is we must have a regular meal. The second one is we must have a sufficient amount of food or quantity of food in that meal. And the third one is there needs to be sufficient nutrition or quality in that food. If we neglect any of these three essential components, the end result is we will get physically sick. And that's an absolute rule. We cannot break that rule. Imagine if you have a regular meal and you have a good quantity of food, but if you eat junk food all the time and there's no nutritional value in that meal, if that's your habit pattern over a period of time, your body will eventually become sick. If you have a regular meal and you have good nutrition in that meal, but you eat too much of it or too little of it, the end result will be the same. Take out any one of those components over a period of time and your body will react by becoming sick. Can we say the same thing Do those same components apply to a communication diet as food for the mind? Yes, it does. We can say you have to have regular communication or frequency. We have to have sufficient amount or quantity of communication or length of time talking together. And we have to have sufficient nutrition or quality in that communication. Meaningful content, what do you talk about? And if we neglect any of those three essential components, it will ultimately result in relationship failure, depression, and mental health problems, unless it is addressed. But we have a problem. What is nutrition in the communication diet? How do we define it? If we look at food disorders, we have professionals, dietitians, and they use the concept of nutrition as a focus for remedial action. Nutrition is well defined in food science, with each type of food given a value rating. So a nutritionist or dietitian might look at your food diet and look at the food on your plate and analyse its nutritional value, give it a rating, and then maybe change the meals on your plate, give you a diet with better nutritional values, and measure the effect of that over a period of time. So nutrition is well defined in food diets. So how do we define and rate nutrition in the communication diet? Well, here's an idea. There are 3 levels of communication. We'll make them up. The first is the superficial or greeting level. Hi, Ben. How you going? Nice to see you again. Beautiful day today, isn't it? There's a more deeper communication level where we might exchange ideas and information about a particular topic. And there's a third level called the meaningful or personal level. You tend to get down to that level when you're engaged in a relationship with somebody else, for example. We talk about your wife or your girlfriend. When you first meet, you find yourself speaking on the superficial level. If there are appropriate responses over a period of time, then you will go to a deeper level, information sharing level. If the responses are appropriate and you like what you hear, you might proceed to a meaningful or more personal level. Talk about the things that matter to you. Could be politics, could be religion, could be money, could be anything, so long as it's on that meaningful personal level. When we meet someone for the first time, we don't normally start talking to them on the third level. That's seen as being a bit too forward. Generally, we'll proceed through those 3 levels in new relationships as we build them up and establish a bond. Which level contains the most nutrition? Well, let's look at the first level. Is it possible to establish a close, meaningful, and enduring relationship if communication with a particular person is mostly only on that first level? You probably say no. What about the next level? Is it possible to establish a close, meaningful, and enduring relationship if communication with a particular person is mostly on the second level, this information sharing level? Well, again, if you think about it, you'll probably say no. What about the third level, the meaningful personal level? Is it possible to establish a close, meaningful, and enduring relationship if communication is mostly and frequently on that third level? The answer would be yes. We have these value judgments of communication in our minds. Living things can't survive without daily nutrition, and it's obvious that neither can relationships. Between man and wife, between man and man, between woman and woman, or with God. Children love to frequently be with someone who communicates with them in a meaningful and interesting way. Can we say they find it very nutritious? Yes. When Jesus said in Matthew 18 verse 3, "Except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." When he said that, perhaps he meant, except you learn to communicate frequently and meaningfully with God, you shall never develop a relationship with him that is so important to you that you want to be with him forever in his kingdom. That's really food for thought. Well, what are the principles of effective communication in relationships? Maintenance of enduring relationships depends upon effective listening and responding skills. We listen attentively, we pay attention, visually as well as by hearing, and we respond appropriately. Both those factors will affect how a relationship is maintained and continued. And that has to enable extensive conversation on level 3 on a regular basis. We need that nutrition on a regular basis in an appropriate quantity, just like we need our daily food. We have to have this communicative food, this communicative nutrition at the same frequency regularly and at length. Now, if either party in a relationship repeatedly makes an unacceptable number of inappropriate responses at any communication level, first, second, or third level, then the relationship will start to break down and cool off. Failure to continuously feed a relationship with regular third-level communication will eventually result in frustration, depression, and relationship breakdown. What's all this got to do with hearing loss? Well, hearing loss directly affects relationships and the communication diet by impeding the ability to use effective listening and responding skills. How can a person make an appropriate response if they're unsure what was said to them? Therefore, for a hard-of-hearing person, the ability to progress a relationship through the 3 levels of conversation can be much slower or even completely obstructed by poor hearing. Too many inappropriate responses for any reason causes frustration for everyone involved and stops conversation proceeding to a higher level. Ultimately, if this happens continuously, it leads to relationship failure, isolation, social rejection, and loneliness, with all the attendant mental health problems. That is true for people with normal hearing. It's much more true for people with any degree of hearing loss, particularly if the hearing loss is severe. People with severe to profound hearing loss are more likely to experience difficulty maintaining relationships on the 3rd level because of a high number of inappropriate responses caused by not hearing clearly. And therefore, they're more likely to suffer from an impoverished communication diet, which results in damaged relationships, depression, and mental health problems, unless remedial action is taken by everyone involved. Does that affect people with all levels of hearing loss? No. More so people with severe to profound hearing loss. People with mild hearing loss who use hearing aids can usually function reasonably well. But when the loss becomes severe, it's bad news. People with mild to moderate hearing loss who successfully use hearing aids do not usually suffer such extensive effects on their communication diet, unless they repeatedly fail to use their hearing technology. And it affects everyone, not just the person with the hearing loss. If the hard-of-hearing person refuses to use hearing aids, then the responsibility for the resulting relationship strain is shifted to other parties who are forced to deal with the adverse effects. In other words, they have to shout, they have to repeat, they have to tolerate a television that's too loud, and they have to appear sometimes aggressive because it does create aggression in someone who's trying to communicate and cannot get through. Family members and friends who are forced to try and communicate with a person who refuses to acknowledge their hearing loss, and this happens a lot. I've seen many patients who had this problem. Or if they use hearing aids to make them, if they refuse to acknowledge their hearing loss or use hearing aids to make themselves more user-friendly, people involved in a relationship like that, if it isn't corrected, they may take two steps. They may find themselves reverting to communication levels 1 or 2 because it's too hard to communicate on a third level. If it causes a lot of problems, it can cause a breaking up of that relationship. And I've seen this happen with many patients, unfortunately. I've seen many marriages break up because one of them refused to acknowledge hearing loss. I'll be okay, they say. You just speak up a little bit, I'll be fine. But the reality is much harder. Often the hard of hearing person does not realize the burden that they put on others who don't have a hearing loss but are in a relationship with you. What was previously easy and comfortable and even enjoyable can become very hard and difficult to maintain. Likewise, if companions with normal hearing refuse to adjust their communication habits to help compensate for residual hearing problems, even when hearing aids are used, then an unfair burden is forced upon the person with the hearing loss who must function at higher stress levels. I've seen this happen typically with relationships among a husband and wife who came to my clinic on many occasions. The wife, for example, might expect that the hearing aid is going to cure the problem, and they should be able to communicate normally once the hearing aids are in. But that's not the case. If the loss is profound or severe, we find that because the hearing aid cannot cure the hearing loss completely, walking away from someone when you're talking, speaking from another room, doesn't work very well anymore. You just can't do that. You can't keep that rule up. You have to change that communication rule and make sure you face one another when you speak. What are some of the remedial resources to this problem? For partial hearing loss, we're not talking about total deafness here. Well, one is we have to use the potential of the latest hearing aids with Bluetooth wireless streaming technology. Bluetooth wireless streaming in hearing aids is a recently produced technology that enables the phone to communicate directly with the hearing aid wirelessly with no hookup, no wired hookup. It means that if someone's talking on the phone, the audio is streamed directly to the hearing aid with no loss in audio quality. And it also means that if you're watching videos or something on your phone, that can also be streamed directly into the hearing aids. Not all hearing aids have this technology, but most of the current edition hearing aids do have it. The second thing is, with this knowledge, ask your church and other public venues to install assistive listening devices, such as Listen Everywhere, which we're going to talk more about in the second seminar. Hearing aid users with mild hearing loss may get sufficient benefit from the hearing aids alone, and they don't need to use assistive listening systems. Sometimes you find this. You can install technology in a church only to find that somebody with a hearing aid might say to you, I don't need it, I can hear fine with my hearing aids. That's true for some. If the loss is mild, even moderate, they're okay, hearing aids are fine. But if the loss is moderate to severe, they will get significant benefit from assistive listening devices in churches and public venues, because it enables hearing with more clarity and less interference from background noise. Background noise is the big killer for people with hearing aids, because the hearing aid cannot sort out speech in a room full of people. If you want to try and talk to one person, it's very difficult to separate the speech from the speech of other people around you. There's other things that people can do, apart from utilising these devices. When you're communicating with somebody with hearing loss, we need to adjust our communication habits a little bit. Number one, always try to face the hard of hearing person while speaking. You can't talk walking away from them anymore, or with your back turned, and expect that they will have full comprehension. B, keep hands and objects away from your face while speaking. If your hand is covering up your face while you're talking and you're mumbling away, it's very difficult for someone who's partly dependent on lip reading to understand what you're saying. Avoid talking out of sight in another room. Avoid appearing aggressive or impatient by shouting. Sometimes people do this. And the interesting thing is that somebody who can't hear is often regarded with disfavour, and someone may try to talk to them aggressively. Didn't you hear me? Have you got your hearing aid turned on? Turn your hearing aid up. Speak loudly, shout, repeat, and they get the sensation that you are very aggressive. You don't want to portray that by shouting or having an aggressive appearance on your face. Number C, men, if you have a beard, men, keep them trimmed so that the upper lip is visible, because that's important for lip reading, especially the corners. If the moustache or the beard obscures the corners or covers the top lip, it's nearly impossible for somebody who is severely hard of hearing to try and understand what you're saying. Here's another one, and there's a little video associated with this one. Use microphones correctly when presenting. I want you to watch this little video.
When speaking with the microphone, it is very important that you hold it properly, because otherwise people won't be able to hear you. The first step is making sure that you hold it firmly so that you don't drop it. Simply hold the microphone with your full hand and not only with the fingers. Hold the microphone by the handle, not here. And also, although you might be a hip-hop fan, don't hold it like this. Simply hold it with your full hand by the handle. Now we will go through the 3 best positions for holding the microphone to achieve maximum efficiency. But before we get to that, there is one universal rule, a general principle that you should always adhere to when working with the microphone, and that is hold the hand with the microphone steady. Here's the thing. We all gesture with our hands when speaking. However, the problem is when we also gesture with the microphone hand. Every time when you move the microphone away from yourself, people can't hear you. Now, it sounds something like this. Good evening, ladies. Thank you here. Tonight, I would like to talk about me. So remember, you can do anything you want with your free hand, but the hand with the microphone has to stay steady. Don't point to anything with it, don't gesture with it, don't wave your friends in the audience with it. The microphone hand has to stay steady. Now, the 3 best microphone positions are: number 1, hold the microphone in a horizontal, slightly diagonal position in the height of your mouth with a distance of about 3 to 4 fingers between them. Seen from the front, it looks something like this. The position number 2 is similar, but you hold the microphone in a vertical position, slightly in front and under your chin, also about 3 to 4 fingers between them. This position may be even better because your face is not covered, so this is the position that I actually recommend the most. The position number 3 can be very helpful if you have difficulties keeping the microphone hand steady. What you can do is simply lean the microphone against your chin so that it stays fixed, and to make sure that you don't move it away from yourself. It may feel somewhat weird, but trust me, it is perfectly normal, and even some professionals do it. So, there you have it, how to hold the microphone so that your message is heard.
We also need to understand that the needs of people with partial hearing loss is entirely different from the needs of people who are profoundly deaf and prefer to communicate with sign language. It's a completely different scenario. Most hard of hearing people are culturally and linguistically no different from their normal hearing peers, and they have little in common with the language and culture of the deaf signing community. People with total deafness can be categorized into two groups. Number one are sign language users, and number two are what we call oral deaf or lip readers. Those who are orally deaf may not be fluent with sign language and prefer not to socialize with signers. This is a very strange phenomenon, which I encountered this when I was a student in Washington, D.C. We had an organization called the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf, which wasn't far away in the city from the university I studied at, called Gallaudet University. We decided one day, a group of students, we would go down to the Alexander Graham Bell Association and do a little interview and ask them about their philosophy, why they were different from Gallaudet, why they didn't use signs. And when we went into their office to the reception, there was a man behind the counter there who was obviously a deaf person. We tried to communicate with him using signs, thinking that he would at least understand it. And he said, no, don't use signs. I don't need sign language. Just speak. Well, we tried to speak and mouth the words out to him. He didn't get it. He couldn't understand it. Ultimately, we had to write it down before he could understand what we were saying. But the interesting thing is, he was just as deaf as the people at the university, at Gallaudet University, but didn't want to be involved with sign language. This is interesting. Why did this happen? We'll come to that in a minute. Both of these groups can experience difficulties reading and expressing themselves in the correct word order used by speakers with normal hearing. So even though they may comprehend what you're saying, when they try to express themselves, depending on how good their educational background has been, they may have difficulty getting the things in correct word order of the language group they're used to. That doesn't mean they are in any way intellectually disabled. It simply means that for them, their native language, the spoken language, is a second language. It's not their first language. Their first language is a visual language, the order of which things happen. It's not necessarily a language word order. Signing deaf people often regard the spoken language of their country as their second language. And they often prefer to fellowship with each other because they all use the same language. And it is easier to communicate with each other on the third level in their communication diets. They probably don't think of that, but that's the reality. Because they get good, appropriate listening and responding skills, although it's visual, they can carry on a normal conversation and have normal social relationships. And that's the same reason immigrants from other language groups often prefer to fellowship with each other, because it's easier for them to get onto a third level of communication with the people they're talking to. Much harder if you try to communicate with people who are not of your language group. And for the same reason, people with partial hearing loss prefer to stay within their usual hearing environment, because the signing deaf environment represents a group identity they want to avoid at all costs. They don't want to go down the road of total deafness. That's anathema to them. But that's not always true. There are exceptional cases, and I can remember quite a few cases of people at Gallaudet who were studying there, doing advanced courses in understanding deafness. They were hard of hearing themselves, but they were happy to be involved with the deaf community. They're not like people who are totally deaf and want nothing to do with signers. That's not the case. Some people are quite happy to fit between the two cultures. People who are categorized as orally deaf also prefer to remain in a normal hearing environment. because unfortunately they've been taught to regard sign language as not representing normal communication. They do not want to be seen as different. This idea came from Charles Darwin and Alexander Graham Bell. They were contemporaries in that era. And the interesting thing is Charles Darwin and his Origin of the Species, he imagined that if deaf people were allowed to associate together in cultural groups and use sign language, eventually, over a period of time, it would result in the formation of a deaf race. Not correct thinking. He didn't understand genetics like we understand it today. But he convinced Alexander Graham Bell that this was the case. But the two of them got together and went around all the schools for the deaf in the United States. It became public policy to close down all the schools for the deaf where the teachers and administrators were often deaf themselves and used sign language. They had to be closed down to stop this spread of a deaf race, this theoretical deaf race. So as a result, as these schools closed down, it didn't just happen in the United States, it happened around the world. As these deaf schools closed down, and the teachers who could sign, the deaf teachers themselves, were moved on. They were kicked out and replaced with people with normal hearing who were going to teach the deaf to communicate in a normal way by lip reading and speaking. Well, it was not very successful. A few did manage to get around those obstacles, but many did not. And I can remember in my earlier professional years in Australia working with the deaf community whose education had been badly affected for years because of this philosophy that sign language should be banned and should not be used. It took years to get out of those habits and to overcome those things. Because of this attitude, people who don't want to be seen as deaf, want to be seen as part of the hearing community but cannot communicate easily, they may suffer unnecessarily from an impoverished communication diet. Because it's much harder to get to the third level because it's difficult to make an appropriate response if you can't hear what people are saying properly. You have to guess and you have to bluff. So they will experience relationships that are difficult to progress beyond the first or second level of communication. In contrast, deaf people who are fluent in sign language can be part of a familiar language community that experiences the same ease of nutritious communication on level 3 as people with normal hearing. So they don't suffer the same effects. They don't have a problem with the communication diet. Within a signing community, the communication diet of deaf sign language users is not as affected by inappropriate responses to the same degree as people with severe partial hearing loss, who often experience great difficulty making appropriate responses in a conversation with people with normal hearing, especially in noise. Hard of hearing people have a lot more trouble maintaining or developing a communication diet than do the deaf people in the signing community. So when we take deaf people out of an educational environment where they can sign and try to mainstream them or put them into an educational environment where people don't sign but use speech and lip reading, this is tantamount to child abuse. And it should not be practiced. If you're going to move deaf people out of their signing environment, put them in an environment where communication is much more difficult, you're robbing them of their communication diet. You're robbing them of nutrition in their communication diet. This is a very important point. That if you're going to take them out of that environment, make sure that we include all manner of communication methods to ensure that they can optimize their communication diet. This is very, very important. What about some suggestions for deaf ministers? Here's your first tip. Provide qualified sign language interpreters at churches in areas with high concentrations of deaf signers. And in Australia, funds for interpreters in churches are available. If you contact Christian Services for the Blind and Hearing Impaired at the Adventist Media Centre, you will find that funds are available to pay for a sign language interpreter to come to your church for a specific program. That's a wonderful blessing. Number 2, raise funds to train and employ a Bible worker with fluent signing skills to work in selected areas near churches with interpreted services. And ultimately, down the track, aim to establish dedicated services for the deaf as an annex to a supportive church. Number 4, if we go back to number 3 for a minute, ultimately, like immigrants who come to another culture, they like to fellowship together for maximum communication diet. The deaf community also benefit most if ultimately they can be involved in a church group where they have a deaf pastor or at least a pastor who is very fluent in sign language. They enjoy that the most. Number 4, create a scholarship fund to train and employ a person fluent in sign language, preferably a deaf person, as a pastor for the deaf. Funds to do that are also available in Australia from Christian Services for the Blind and Hearing Impaired. That may also be the case in the United States, but I'm not sure. Other countries can do the same. Next one. Number 5, add closed captions to as many current videos as possible and make it a policy that all future videos produced by the church must include closed captions and, where possible, a sign language interpreter. To learn more, if you go to this website, possibilityministries.org/ministries/deaf, you can learn a lot more about how to provide a specific dedicated ministry to people who are deaf and use sign language. That's the end of this seminar. Don't miss the description of technology options in the next seminar on assistive listening for churches. Thank you for listening. You can contact me at these details. May the Lord bless you as you consider this additional ministry for your church.